My husband spent $38,000 on legal fees trying to claim 40% of the appreciation on my design studio, and he did it without knowing I'd had him sign away that exact claim 4 years before he ever thought to make it. I want to walk through this one slowly, because the number that matters most isn't the 38,000. It's a much smaller number, one signature, on one document, dated a Tuesday in March, 4 years before either of us said the word divorce out loud. I'll call him Derek. That's not his real name, but the studio he tried to take a piece of is real, and I built every part of it before I ever met him. The pattern, in the small stuff, before any of this started. I started my studio at 24, 5 years before Derek and I got married, working out of a converted garage with 3 clients and a business loan co-signed by my father. By the time Derek and I got engaged, it was valued at just under $2 million. Not because I'm telling you this to brag, but because that number is the entire spine of what happened later, and you need it early. Here's what I didn't fully clock while we were dating, the way you don't clock things when you're happy. Derek would bring up the studio's valuation at dinner parties, casually, the way you'd mention someone's salary if you thought it made a good conversation opener. He joked, more than once, in front of my own sister, that once we were married, what's yours is mine, baby, that's how it works, and laughed, like it was cute. He suggested, gently, twice, that it might make sense to add his name to the studio's LLC, just for tax purposes, and got quietly irritated. Both times I said I'd think about it, and then didn't. When I hired a bookkeeper the year before the wedding, he asked, more than once, whether I really needed one, or whether he could just help out with that kind of thing himself. None of it was a screaming red flag on its own. All of it, lined up afterward, reads like a man circling something for years before he ever tried to take a bite of it. There's one more from around then, I keep coming back to. My father passed 2 years into our marriage, and he'd left me a small amount of money separate from the studio, nothing dramatic, enough to matter. At the reading of the will, in front of my mother and my sister, Derek asked the estate attorney, half joking, whether that inheritance would be combined property or her thing, in a tone that made it sound like idle curiosity instead of what it actually was. My mother told me later she'd wanted to say something right there in the room, and hadn't, because it was my grief to manage that day, not an argument to start on top of it. Who I was before any of this. I want to give you one memory from before Derek, because I think you need to understand what the studio actually cost me to build before you understand why I fought this hard to keep it separate. Year 1, I was doing client consultations out of a garage with a space heater that only worked if you kicked it in a specific spot. Taking on jobs I was underpriced for because I needed the portfolio more than the money. I remember a specific Tuesday, a client walking out mid-meeting because she didn't believe a 24-year-old could handle a whole house renovation, and me sitting alone afterward on a paint-splattered stool, doing the math on whether I could make rent that month if I picked up a 4th job on top of the 3 I already had. I made rent that month. I made it every month after that too, eventually without needing the math, and by the time I met Derek at a mutual friend's dinner party 5 years later, the garage was a real studio with 4 employees and a wait list. I'm not telling you this to make myself sound impressive. I'm telling you because when Derek would joke about what's mine is yours, baby, some part of me, a part I didn't examine closely enough at the time, always flinched a little at how easily he said it. Like the space heater, and the walked-out client, and all those underpriced years were just a starting balance, instead of the actual price. I think about that space heater more than almost anything else from that whole decade. I still have it, actually, in a closet in my current apartment. Half broken, definitely not up to code. I don't know why I kept it. I think some part of me wanted a physical object that remembered what the studio actually cost before anyone else was around to remember it with me. How the prenup happened, and how the loophole got closed before either of us knew there'd be a loophole to close. My lawyer, a family attorney named Priya, who I'd used since the LLC formation, drew up the prenup 8 months before the wedding. Standard language, mostly. The studio and its appreciation stayed separate property, full stop, no ambiguity about what came into the marriage versus what got built inside it. I remember the actual signing more clearly than I remember most of the wedding planning that surrounded it. Derek read it at Priya's conference table, flipping pages faster than I thought someone should for a document about to bind him for however long we lasted. And when he got to the end, he looked up and said, "So, basically, if this doesn't work out, I walk away with nothing that was already yours. I told him that was the point. He shrugged and signed it, and said something about how he wasn't marrying me for the business anyway, which felt sweet at the time and reads differently to me now. In the specific way almost everything from that era reads differently now. Here's the part that ended up mattering more than the prenup itself. In year 3 of our marriage, I was redesigning the studio's brand. New site, new client-facing materials, and Derek offered to help, since he'd done some freelance web work years earlier before switching to sales. I said yes, mostly because it felt nice, him wanting to be involved in something that was mine. Priya, when I mentioned it to her at an unrelated meeting about a supplier contract, got a specific look on her face I'd come to recognize over the years as her seeing 3 moves ahead of wherever I currently was. She asked if Derek was being compensated for the web work. I said no, obviously not. He's my husband. It's just him being nice. That's exactly the problem, she said. Uncompensated marital labor that contributes to the appreciation of separate property can end up creating a claim on that appreciation down the line, depending on how things go and which state we're in. I'm not saying anything's wrong right now. I'm saying let's paper it so nothing that feels generous today turns into a legal argument in 10 years. I remember thinking she was being a little paranoid. I signed what she put in front of me anyway, because Priya had never once been wrong about anything in 6 years of working with her. It was a single page, an acknowledgement that Derek's contribution to the rebrand was a personal favor, uncompensated, made with no expectation of equity, ownership, or future financial interest in the studio or its value. Derek signed it too, barely reading it, joking that it was very official for a guy just fixing a website for his wife. It was notarized. It went into a folder. I didn't think about it again for almost 4 years. I'm not going to spend long on how the marriage actually ended, because it isn't really the point of this story, and it wasn't dramatic in the way you might expect. Derek lost his sales job 18 months before we separated, in a round of layoffs that wasn't his fault, and something in him changed after that, in a way I don't think either of us handled well. He grew resentful in ways he never quite said out loud but that showed up everywhere. In how he talked about my clients, in how long it took him to be happy for me when a project went well, in a specific tightness around his mouth every time I mentioned the studio's growth at dinner. There's one dinner in particular I still think about. I just closed the largest single contract in the studio's history, a hospitality group renovating 6 properties, and I came home wanting to celebrate. Derek congratulated me. Technically, the actual words were there, but he spent the rest of the meal talking about a job he'd interviewed for that week that hadn't panned out, and by the time we were doing dishes, he said, quietly, not quite looking at me, "Must be nice. Everything just working out for you." I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't, 4 years later, except that I think that was the exact dinner where some door between us started closing that neither of us ever managed to fully open again. We separated 11 months ago. The divorce has been, by the standards of these things, relatively civil, until it wasn't. Part of the divorce process meant getting the studio formally valued for the proceedings, which is its own strange experience. Watching a stranger with a clipboard spend 3 days walking through a decade of your life and turning it into a single number. The appraiser, a woman named Carol who did this for a living and treated my studio with exactly the same clinical warmth she'd probably given the last 40 businesses she'd valued, came back with $6,400,000. $4,600,000 of that had accumulated during the marriage. I remember sitting with that report at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd once done math on a 4th job to make rent, and feeling a strange kind of vertigo looking at how far the studio had come from that number. Most of that growth, if I'm honest with myself, happened because of market conditions, a location I'd fought hard to lease early, and 4 employees who worked as hard as I did. A small piece of it, genuinely, probably did benefit from a nicer website. I don't think that's nothing. I just don't think it's worth what came next. I found out about the claim the way I find out about most things that matter, which is to say sideways, through a document I wasn't supposed to see quite yet. Priya forwarded me his attorney's filing late on a Thursday, a financial disclosure response filed less than 2 weeks after the appraisal numbers went final, and buried on page 4, in the flat language lawyers use to make enormous things sound procedural, was a claim for 40% of the studio's $4,600,000 in marital period appreciation. A specific dollar figure, $1,840,000. based on an argument that his uncompensated contributions to the business, including the rebrand, constituted active marital effort that increased the studio's value beyond passive market appreciation. I read that page standing in my kitchen with my coat still on, and I laughed. Not a happy laugh. The kind that comes out when your body doesn't know what else to do with a number that big, attached to your own name. I called Priya before I'd even taken my coat off. She picked up on the second ring, and I could hear in her voice that she already knew exactly which document I was calling about. "Do you remember a single page you signed in the spring of our third meeting about the supplier contract?" she said. "About the website." I did remember. I told her I did. She said she'd already pulled it from the file before I called, because she'd been half expecting something like this claim to surface the moment she saw his attorney's name on the case, and she wanted to know if I remembered it before she told me what it meant for his 40%. "It means his entire claim is built on the exact thing he signed away," she said. "He's asking for money based on a contribution he legally agreed, in writing, notarized, came with no expectation of financial interest. If that document holds up, and I don't see why it wouldn't, his claim doesn't just fail. It's not close." I asked her, still standing in my kitchen, coat now finally off but still in my hand, why she thought he'd try this at all if there was any chance he remembered signing it away. She said people don't always remember the specific documents they've signed, especially ones that felt minor at the time, especially years later when a divorce attorney is sitting across from them, telling them what a marriage might be worth, if they frame the story the right way. "He probably believes his own claim," she said. "That's usually how these go. It's rarely a man twirling a mustache. It's a man who's been told a version of events by someone paid to find him one, and he wants badly enough to believe it that he doesn't go digging for the page that contradicts it." Derek called me directly 9 days after the filing, which I later learned his own attorney had specifically told him not to do. I almost didn't pick up. I did, mostly out of the same instinct that makes you check a wound even when you already know it's going to hurt. He didn't open with the claim. He opened with our marriage, actually. A soft run-up about how he didn't want this to get ugly, how he still cared about me even though things ended the way they did, how he thought maybe we could work something out between us before the lawyers made it worse than it needed to be. I let him talk for almost 2 minutes before he got to the actual point. "I put real time into that studio," he said. "The rebrand, sure, but also just being there, supporting you through the growth years. That's not nothing. I'm not trying to take your business. I just think I'm owed something for the years I put in. You were compensated for those years," I told him. "It's called a marriage. We shared a home, a life, everything either of us earned during it, except the one thing we specifically agreed in writing would stay separate." "That agreement was before I really understood what I was signing," he said. "I was 29. I didn't have a lawyer read it line by line." "You had Priya explain every page of it to both of us in her office," I said. "You asked questions about 2 other clauses that day. You didn't ask about that one." He got quiet for a second, and then he said something that I think, looking back, told me everything about where his head actually was. "I just think after everything, I deserve to walk away with something that reflects what I put into us. Not what I put into the studio specifically, into us." I told him I understood that he felt that way, and that feeling it didn't make it a legal claim, and that I wasn't going to negotiate the studio over the phone 9 days after a formal filing his own attorney probably didn't know he was making. He said he needed to think about how to respond to that. I told him to take his time. We hung up without either of us saying anything close to warm. I called Priya right after, mostly just to tell her it had happened. She wasn't surprised. "That's actually useful," she said, in the specific flat tone she used when she was thinking 3 steps ahead of the conversation. "It tells me he's not being driven purely by his attorney's strategy. Some part of this is personal for him. That matters for how we handle the room later." My sister Jess came over that night with a bottle of wine. Neither of us really drank, and I told her the whole thing, the claim, the document, all of it. She sat with her mouth slightly open for a solid 10 seconds before she said anything. "So he's about to spend a fortune on lawyers," she said. "Arguing for money he already signed away 4 years ago, and he doesn't know it. Looks like it. Are you going to tell him now? Save him the legal fees?" I didn't have an answer for that yet. I told her honestly that some part of me wanted to call his attorney directly and end it before it went any further, and another part of me, a part I wasn't proud of, wanted to watch this specific claim, The one built on the exact thing he'd waved off as just being nice. Play all the way out in a room with both our lawyers in it. Jess didn't tell me which instinct to listen to. She just asked what I thought Derek would do if the numbers were reversed. I didn't answer that one out loud. I think we both already knew. She called me again 2 days later, unprompted, just to say she'd been thinking about it and wanted to add one thing. "I keep picturing you as the person who just quietly hands over the document and moves on with her life," she said. "And I love that person. I'm just not sure she's the only person allowed to show up here. He didn't quietly do anything to you. He built a whole legal argument. I don't think you owe him a quiet ending just because a quiet ending would look better on you." I didn't fully agree with her in the moment. I've thought about that phone call more than almost any other conversation from that whole stretch of months, though, which probably tells you something about which part of me eventually won. Priya asked me almost the identical question about 2 weeks later, sitting across from me in her office with the file open between us. She told me plainly that she could send opposing counsel the document tomorrow, end the claim in a single email, and save both sides a significant amount of money and time. She also told me, just as plainly, that some clients in my position preferred to let a bad faith claim proceed further before producing the document, particularly when there was a fee-shifting clause in the prenup that would only fully apply once the claim had actually been filed and pursued in the proceeding, not just threatened. "That's not legal advice toward cruelty," she said. "That's just how the fee provision is written. I want you to understand the mechanism, not just the outcome, before you decide what kind of story you want this to be when it's over." I sat with that for longer than I expected to. Ending it early was the version of me I liked better in the abstract. Efficient, generous even, the bigger person. Letting it run was the version that got to watch, in real time, in a room he couldn't leave, exactly what his own signature had already decided 4 years before he tried to go back on it. I asked Priya, before I gave her my answer, whether she'd have judged me either way. She said that wasn't her job, and then, after a pause, added that in 15 years of doing this work, she'd stopped believing there was a version of divorce where the wronged party got to stay perfectly gracious the entire way through and still feel like they'd actually stood up for themselves. Grace and self-protection aren't always the same instinct, she said. Sometimes you get to pick which one this particular moment is for. I told Priya to let it proceed to the scheduled mediation. I want to be honest that I knew, choosing that, I wasn't choosing the version of myself I'd have described as the better one if you'd asked me in the abstract a year earlier. It was in a conference room downtown, neutral territory, the kind of room with a long table and a box of tissues nobody ever wants to need. Derek was already there when I arrived, in a suit I recognized from our wedding, which felt like its own strange detail to notice. I sat down across from him for the first time in 3 months. He gave me a small nod, careful, the kind of nod you give someone when you're not sure yet whether the day is going to be adversarial or just administrative. I gave him one back. Priya set her folder down beside mine, unopened, and I noticed she'd placed it at a specific angle, close enough to reach in one motion, and I understood without her saying anything that she'd been ready for this exact moment since the day I first called her about the filing. His attorney opened with the claim, laid out clean and confident, the $1,840,000 figure, the argument about active marital contribution, a slide, actually, an entire slide with a chart showing the studio's valuation curve with an arrow pointing at the year of the rebrand, like it proved something. He spoke for almost 12 minutes. I counted, mostly to keep my hands from doing anything else while I listened. Derek looked steady through most of it, certain, even. I watched him glance at me twice with an expression I can only describe as controlled anticipation, like a man who thinks he's about to watch a debt finally get collected. At one point, he even leaned slightly toward his attorney and nodded at something on the slide, like a man confirming a fact he already fully believed. Priya let the presentation finish completely before she said a word. She let the silence after it sit for a beat longer than was comfortable too, which I don't think was an accident. Then she opened her folder, slid a single page across the table, and said, "Before we go further into valuation, I want to enter this into the record. It's dated March of 2021. I believe your client signed it." I watched Derek's eyes find the page. I watched the specific half-second where recognition arrived before understanding did. The look of someone seeing a document they remember signing but haven't yet connected to the room they're currently sitting in. Then I watched understanding catch up. His shoulders dropped maybe half an inch. It's a small movement. I noticed every millimeter of it. "This is about the website thing," he said, and his voice had already lost some of its floor by the time he finished the sentence. "It's an acknowledgement," Priya said, "notarized, that your contribution to the rebrand was an uncompensated personal favor, made with no expectation of equity or financial interest in the studio. Your entire claim today is built on that exact contribution. I'd ask you to review it with your counsel before we continue." His attorney picked up the page. I watched his eyes move down at once. Fast, professional, and then a second time, slower. The read of someone checking whether there's an angle they're missing, and coming up empty both times. He set it down without saying anything for a moment. That silence told me more than anything he said afterward. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when a chart on a slide stops meaning what everyone in the room thought it meant 30 seconds earlier. Derek's attorney read the page twice, I think, though it only needed one read, and I watched something shift in his posture. Not anger exactly, more like a man recalculating how much of the day he'd just wasted. Derek looked at me. "You had me sign this," he said, 4 years ago. "You knew this whole time." "I forgot about it for most of those 4 years," I said. This was the one direct thing I said in that whole meeting, and I'd decided in advance it would be the only one. Priya didn't. His attorney asked for a recess. They took 40 minutes in a separate room. When they came back, the claim wasn't withdrawn exactly. It was, Priya explained to me afterward, narrowed to nothing, which is a polite way lawyers describe a claim quietly bleeding out, rather than being formally killed on the spot. His attorney read a short, careful statement about revisiting the valuation approach in light of newly reviewed documentation. Derek didn't say anything else for the rest of the session. He signed where he needed to sign, and he left before I did, which I was grateful for, because I don't think either of our faces were fully under control by that point. The satisfaction and the sickness, together, the first time. I felt something settle in my chest, watching that recess get called. Not triumphant, not exactly, but something close to it, a very specific relief that comes from watching a thing you built with your own hands get protected by paperwork you barely remembered signing. 4 years of not thinking about that page, and it turned out to be the most important thing in the room. But underneath that, almost right away, came something else. Watching Derek's face while he read that document. Watching a man I'd shared 11 years with realize, in real time, in front of 2 attorneys and a mediator, that his own signature had already answered the question he'd spent $38,000 asking. I didn't feel guilty about the document. I felt something quieter and less comfortable about having chosen, on purpose, to let him walk all the way into that room before he found out. Under the prenup's fee-shifting clause, the one that activates once a claim on separate property has actually been filed and pursued, rather than just floated, Derek ended up responsible for a portion of my legal costs on top of his own, something in the range of $22,000 once everything settled. Combined with what he'd already spent building the claim, it came to right around $60,000, spent pursuing a right he'd signed away for exactly nothing 4 years earlier. Jess's reaction, when I told her the final numbers, was somewhere between a laugh and a wince. "I don't know whether to say good or say that's kind of brutal," she said. "Both," I told her. "I think it's allowed to be both." Not everyone in our shared circle saw it the same way. A mutual friend, someone who'd been at our wedding, told me at a birthday party a few weeks later that she understood why I hadn't just handed over the document immediately, but that watching it unfold in a room with lawyers present felt, to her, less like justice and more like a trap someone had built and then waited patiently to spring. I didn't argue with her. I told her I understood why it looked that way, because some days I thought it looked that way too. My mother, when I told her the whole story over the phone, went quiet for a second and then said something I didn't expect. "Your father would have told you to send the document over the second you found the claim," she said. "He didn't believe in making people sit in a room to learn a lesson. He believed in winning and then going home." I told her I understood that instinct, and that some part of me even agreed with it, and that I still wasn't sorry about the choice I'd actually made. She said that was fine too, that she hadn't called to talk me out of anything, just to tell me what he'd have said, because she thought I might want to know. I called Priya about that conversation actually, a few days later, mostly just to talk it through out loud with someone who'd been in the room. She reminded me, gently, that I hadn't fabricated anything, hadn't planted anything, hadn't done a single thing except decline to volunteer information before a formal legal claim made that information relevant. You let a document that already existed do its job on its own timeline, she said. That's not the same as building a trap, but I understand why it doesn't feel entirely clean to you either. It rarely does, even when you're right. I want to be fair to him here, because I think it matters. Derek didn't try this because he woke up one day and decided to become someone who defrauds his ex-wife. He tried it, I think, because losing his job 18 months earlier had taken something from him that had nothing to do with money. Some sense of being the one who provided, who mattered financially in the relationship. And by the time we were sitting across a mediation table, some part of him had convinced himself that a claim on my studio wasn't theft, it was restoration. That doesn't make it okay. It does make it human, and I've tried to hold on to that instead of just holding on to the number. I heard, secondhand, through a friend who stayed in touch with him, that the $60,000 set him back badly enough that he had to move in with his brother for a while afterward. Which is its own strange thing to sit with. Knowing a piece of paper I signed, without much thought, 4 years earlier, ended up shaping where someone slept for the better part of a year. I don't feel responsible for that. I want to be clear about that. I just don't feel nothing about it either. We don't talk much now, beyond what the custody schedule for our dog technically requires. He sent one message, weeks after the mediation, that just said, "I shouldn't have gone that far. I'm sorry." I believed him. I also didn't write back anything beyond, "Okay." Some apologies you can believe completely, and still not have any use for. Here's what I actually took from all of it. Protecting something you built doesn't require becoming cold or cruel. Most of the actual protection in this story happened 4 years before I knew I'd need it, in one boring signature I almost didn't think twice about. But I also learned that when the moment finally came to use that protection, I chose the version that let it hurt more than it had to, and I'm still deciding how I feel about that choice. I don't think you have to fully resolve that kind of thing to be at peace with it. I think you're just allowed to carry both. I think about the space heater sometimes, still sitting in that closet, whenever anyone asks me how I feel about how it all ended. It doesn't work anymore. I've never once been tempted to throw it out. If you've ever built something on your own, and then had to fight to keep someone else's hands off it, I'd really like to hear how you protected it. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one.